This is the Commander's Beacon. I am Eric. Let's talk about some unconventional ways to build commander decks. Phylath is a 5/5 legendary elemental that costs 4 red-green. When it enters the battlefield, you create a 0/1 green plant creature token for each basic land you control. And it also has landfall. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, put 4+1/+1 counters on target plant you control. So I've been interested in Phylath ever since it came out with Zendikar Rising, and there's a few different ways you can build with Phylath. We can go with a landfall deck. If we go down the landfall route, we're going to be playing a typical green landfall deck, and we'll include all of the typical landfall enablers and payoffs. I'm not convinced that Phylath is the best way to play a landfall deck. And green landfall by now is a very well-established strategy, and I don't think we need to do another landfall deck right now. So, you guessed it, we're not doing that. Now you might also notice that Phylath's landfall ability puts those +1/+1 counters on any plant. So we could maybe play a plants tribal deck. Now there are currently 37 plant creatures in all of Magic, in Gruul colors, and of those, approximately 37 of them are bad. And that's why plant tribal is just below, let's see here, frog tribal on EDHREC, with only 20 decks. So, yep, we're not doing that either. So instead, we're going to be building primarily around the enters the battlefield effect of Phylath to create lots of plant tokens. Phylath can produce a bunch of tokens all at once, and we can use a variety of spells and effects to repeatedly trigger Phylath's ETB ability, creating tons and tons of tokens. Once we have a bunch of tokens, there's a few different ways we can win. So we should start by looking at other decks that we can use for guidance when building around Phylath's enter the battlefield effect. Now if Phylath looks familiar to you, it's because it's almost an Avenger of Zendikar in the command zone. Now Phylath is arguably worse than Avenger of Zendikar though. Avenger costs 1 more mana, but it creates a plant token for each land you control, whereas Phylath only creates a plant for each basic land you control. So when we play Phylath, we need to prioritize basic lands. Now this is great if we're on a budget, since we can justify excluding dual lands and expensive fetch lands, but otherwise this will make our mana base much less reliable. Now both Avenger and Phylath have landfall, but Avenger of Zendikar will put a +1/+1 counter on each plant you control whenever a land enters the battlefield. Phylath will put 4 +1/+1 counters on a single plant. Now given that your deck has green, so all of your ramp will likely be land ramp, rather than mana rocks for example, you'll likely generate, at minimum, 6 plant tokens when Phylath enters the battlefield, or 7 when Avenger enters. This means whenever you play a land, Avenger will put out at least 8 +1/+1 counters, 1 on each of those plants. And that's the floor. If you had 15 lands when Avenger entered, and then you play another land, you'll distribute 16 +1/+1 counters. Phylath, however, will only give you 4 +1/+1 counters for each land, no matter what. So I've heard arguments that because of these weaknesses, Phylath is worse than Avenger of Zendikar. And I agree, but it really doesn't matter, because Phylath isn't replacing Avenger in the 99, Phylath is going in the command zone, and Avenger can't be your commander, so there's not really much of a comparison here. A more interesting and relevant comparison, especially when we're building around Phylath's enter the battlefield effect, is between Phylath and Prossh, Skyraider of Khur. Now, Prossh is a well-known, highly competitive commander. It's a 5/5 flying dragon in Jund colors, and when you cast Prossh, you create X01 red kobold creature tokens named Kobolds of Khur Keep, where X is the amount of mana spent to cast it. And Prossh also has an activated ability that lets you sacrifice another creature to give Prossh +1/+0 until end of turn. Now, Prossh and Phylath are slightly different in how they generate creature tokens. Prosh's trigger is an on-cast trigger, so you get these tokens even if Prossh is counterspelled, for example. Phylath's trigger is an enter the battlefield effect, so blink effects and the like will get us extra triggers, while they won't with Prossh. I don't want to dwell on this too much, but I wanted to point it out. So Prossh is both a token generator and a sacrifice outlet, and it gives you access to black, so you'll have lots of aristocrat effects, which we won't get with Phylath. And Prossh can also easily get kills with commander damage with his activated ability too. Now we could argue that Phylath probably creates a few more tokens than Prossh most of the time, but other than that, Prossh is almost strictly better in pretty much every way, especially if our focus is on creating and utilizing these creature tokens. So whenever we build with Phylath, and again, especially building around Phylath's enters the battlefield effect, we need to ask, what can Phylath do that Prosh doesn't do better? And the answer is not much, but there is one area that we can play with in Phylath that separates it from Prosh, and that is non-basic land hate. Because Phylath wants basic lands, we can use effects that turn off or punish non-basic lands to hinder our opponents. And I'll talk more about these later, but I think we've got a strategy now. We're going to repeatedly trigger Phylath's enter the battlefield effect to create a bunch of tokens. We've got a few ways to use those tokens for victory, which I'll go over later, and because we're playing mostly with basic lands, we'll use non-basic land hate to slow down our opponents to give us time to implement our strategy. So let's go over what's in the deck, starting with the methods that we'll use to trigger Phylath's enter the battlefield effect repeatedly. Typically, in order to abuse enter the battlefield effects, we would play blink effects like Momentary Blink or Eldrazi Displacer. The best of these effects, though, are in Azorius colors. If we want to abuse enters the battlefield effects, and we definitely do, then we'll need to be a bit more creative if we're playing in Gruul colors. First, we'll use any colorless blink effects we can find, most notably Conjurer's Closet and Voyager Staff. Secondly, we can take advantage of green's token doubling effects like Doubling Season, Primal Vigor, Parallel Lives, you know these. These are all enchantments that double all of our token production, and they also all cost $30 or $60 or so. Now, if you have these, use them, but if you don't have them, then one of the best budget alternatives is Second Harvest. Now, this only works once, because it's an instant, but it will catch your opponents by surprise, which is more than we can say for these enchantments. Again, this is a 4-mana instant that essentially doubles the tokens you've got on the battlefield when it resolves. We can also lean on Red's ability to create temporary token copies of creatures with effects like Mirror March, Molten Echoes, and Twin Flame. Now, Phylath is legendary, so the legend rule will kill either the original or the token copy right away, but we'll still get the ETB effect from the token copy, which creates a bunch of plants, which is really all we wanted anyways. Finally, we can use a few bounce effects like Erratic Portal and Temur Sabertooth to bounce Phylath back to our hand in order to recast it and generate its ETB effect again. In any case, there's a bunch of these effects we can choose from, and while most of these aren't as effective as real blink spells that we'd get in Azorius colors, there's definitely more than enough to build around. But let's also consider, we're trying to make as many tokens as we can with Phylath. We don't care much about Phylath's landfall effect, so we don't really care too much about plant tokens specifically. We can have any tokens. So we might also consider other effects that generate creature tokens. Cards like Mycoloth, Tendershoot Dryad, Sprout Swarm, and of course, Avenger of Zendikar. Now, I wouldn't go too far down this path of alternative token generators. After all, our commander Phylath generates tokens all by itself, but it isn't a token payoff. So we probably need to focus more on putting token payoff cards in the deck rather than just more token generators. But you might consider one or two or so of the strongest alternative token generators to supplement Phylath. So between these blink effects and copy effects and so on, I would recommend including about 6 to 10 cards that can amplify Phylath's token generation or alternatively generate creature tokens by some other means. I personally chose to focus heavily on effects that blink my creatures or make token copies of them. That way these effects can also be used with other creatures in my deck that have ETB effects, but you can pick whatever of these types of effects fit your playstyle, budget, meta, etc. Of course, check out the link to the deck list in the description for the specific cards that I've used here. But let's move on to the non-basic land hate feature of this deck. So as we mentioned, Phylath generates a plant token for each basic land we control, so we really want to focus on basic lands in this deck. I've taken it a bit further and focused on non-basic land hate to slow down or punish our opponents. And these cards can really fall into two camps. We can either destroy or deactivate non-basic lands, or we can damage our opponents for using them. The Price of Progress, Burning Earth, and Primal Order all punish our opponents with damage for having or using non-basic lands. Price of Progress is an instant that costs 2 in red, and it deals damage to each player equal to twice the number of non-basic lands they control. Of course, that includes us, but we'll rarely take any damage at all from this. Burning Earth is an enchantment that costs 3 in a red, and it causes each player to take 1 damage whenever they tap a non-basic land for mana. Primal Ardor is somewhat similar. It's an enchantment that costs 2 green, and it damages each player at the beginning of their upkeep, equal to the number of non-basic lands they control. Again, this doesn't hurt us at all in this deck, but it will slowly drain out our opponents. You can also focus on effects that destroy non-basic lands. Ruination is the simplest example. It's 4 mana sorcery that destroys all non-basic lands. From the Ashes and Wave of Vitriol also destroy all non-basic lands, but they let each player find basic lands from their deck to replace them. Some decks run very expensive mana bases with very few basic lands, and these decks will absolutely be shut down by this non-basic land hate, since they might not even have enough basic lands in their deck to replace the non-basics that these cards destroy. Of course, we can also just turn off non-basic lands with effects like Blood Moon, Magus of the Moon, Blood Sun. Blood Moon and Magus of the Moon are similar. They just turn all non-basic lands into mountains, so any non-basic land just taps for red and does nothing else. Blood Sun is a little bit nicer. It only removes abilities from lands that are not mana abilities, so this will disable random combos like Vesuva and Dark Depths, but more importantly it'll shut down fetch lands, but any mana producing abilities on lands that are already on the battlefield will still work normally. Now, a lot of these effects are somewhat like mass land destruction, which some playgroups don't like, so you can choose from these according to what's acceptable in your playgroup. I'm choosing to run 6 of these non-basic land hate cards, and I'm prioritizing ones that cause damage rather than shutting down mana generation, so my opponents can at least still play Magic, or think about playing Magic at least. I'm not running more than 6 of these because they're kind of redundant. You generally don't need more than one such land hate card on the battlefield at any one time. But I definitely want some focus on this non-basic land hate in this deck, since it turns Phylath's downside, that is, carrying only about basic lands, into an upside. But now we can make a bunch of tokens, and we can slow down our opponents with our non-basic land hate, but how do we actually use those tokens to win? There are 3 general ways that this deck will win, and all of them are dependent on amassing a bunch of creatures on the board, which is great because that's exactly what this deck is designed to do. So after we've built up a bunch of creatures, we can win by either, number 1, creating a massive team-wide power boost. Craterhoof Behemoth and the like. There's plenty of options here for high and low budgets. I'm personally not so sure that Phylath is worth building into a $500 plus or $5,000 plus deck, so I've gone with some of the more budget options like Beastmaster Ascension, Shared Animosity, Return of the Wildspeaker. Beastmaster Ascension is an enchantment that gives all of our creatures +5/+5 once we've attacked with 7 creatures essentially. Shared Animosity gives all of our attacking creatures +X+0 until end of turn, where X is the number of other attacking creatures that share a type with it. Both of these fit perfectly in a deck that can easily spew out 10 or 20 or so token creatures of the same type or more. And any of these cards can be dropped onto the battlefield on your turn right before your combat step to give your opponents very little time to respond when your 0/1s turn into 5/6s or something. And I really like Return of the Wildspeaker. This is a 5-mana instant that caps out at giving our creatures only +3 power, which is far less than the other options, but we can alternatively use it to draw cards equal to the greatest power among creatures we control. And Phylath has 5 power, so instant speed, pay 5 to draw 5 is pretty decent. I like the versatility. Now if the combat route bores you, we can also use all of our tokens to create ludicrous amounts of mana. Ashnod's Altar, Phyrexian Altar, Thermopod are among the most potent options here. These allow you to directly sacrifice creatures for mana. Ashnod's Altar is an artifact that costs 3 and lets you sacrifice a creature for 2 colorless mana. Phyrexian Altar also costs 3 mana and $50, and it lets you sacrifice a creature for 1 mana of any color. A Thermopod is a much more budget option. It's a 5 mana 4/3 snow creature that lets you sacrifice a creature for red mana. Now we've also got cards like Cryptolitherite and Song of Freyalise. These are 2 mana enchantments that let all of your creatures tap to add a mana of any color. Song of Freyalise is also a saga that, on its last chapter, will put a +1/+1 counter on each of your creatures, and that gives them Vigilance, Indestructible, and Trample until end of turn. Now, turning all of your 0/1s into 1/2s for a turn will rarely make the difference between winning and losing, so Song of Phylath is mostly just a temporary Cryptolith right in this deck. Now be aware that these enchantments won't let creatures that have summoning sickness tap for mana. So if you cast Phylath into a board that has Cryptolith right already on the battlefield, for example, you won't be able to generate any mana with those tokens that Phylath generates that turn. So if possible, it's generally going to be better to make the tokens first, and then play the Cryptolith Rite or the Song of Phylath on your next turn when those creatures can actually tap for mana and you can use it right away. But what are we doing with all that mana? Well, we're in red, so we'll rely on the usual big X spells. Comet Storm, Banefire, Molten Disaster, and the like. There's plenty of these types of spells, and you can choose whichever you like. Some are instant speed, like Comet Storm. Some can hit multiple targets, also like Comet Storm. So yeah, you should probably use Comet Storm. Some hit everything, like Molten Disaster. Some can't be countered, like Banefire. But there's lots of these you can pick from. Now, outside of X mana finishers, I've also included Wildest Dreams. This is a sorcery that costs XX and green, and it returns X target cards from your graveyard to your hand, then you exile Wildest Dreams. So I strongly believe that almost every deck should run at least a little bit of graveyard recursion, and as long as we have the potential to create a bunch of mana with our tokens, Wildest Dreams makes perfect sense in this deck. Now lastly, we can use our tokens to directly generate damage to our opponents. Impact Tremors deals 1 damage to each opponent whenever a creature enters the battlefield. Obviously, you should play this card in this deck. Goblin Bombardment lets you sacrifice a creature to deal 1 damage to any target. Great, makes perfect sense. I don't need to justify this any further. Let's get to something a little less obvious. I like Outpost Siege. This enchantment lets you pick either Khans or Dragons when it enters the battlefield. If you pick Khans, you get some impulsive card draw of 1 card at the beginning of each of your upkeeps. So if you run out of gas, this is a good choice. Otherwise, you can just pick Dragons, and if you do, whenever a creature you control leaves the battlefield, Outpost Siege deals 1 damage to any target. Of course, this is great with a sacrifice outlet, so you can sacrifice all of your plant tokens on demand. Otherwise, Outpost Siege is still a good board wipe deterrent, since anyone who uses any destroy or damage-based board wipes will give you a bunch of damage to deal out. Now, of course, if you're that kind of player, you can also play Perforos, God of the Forge. Now, rather than going all in on any one of these 3 win condition strategies, I've chosen to play 2 or 3 cards from each strategy. At first, this makes the deck a little more variable to play, since it won't just do exactly the same thing every game. But secondly, I like having some versatility in win conditions, so if my opponent's decks happen to make it hard for me to win with one particular strategy, I still have other strategies to fall back on. As long, of course, as they don't have Elesh Norn. We really don't like Elesh Norn. But in general, using your tokens to create mana is a really strong way to go. And regardless of how much you invest in each of these strategies, I would really encourage you to focus a lot on that mana generation strategy with your tokens. Because even if you can't find an X mana finisher spell, you can still put that mana to use for other things, like dumping your hand onto the battlefield or something. For example, let's say you've got 10 basic lands and a Nashnod's Altar on the battlefield. You can pay 6 to cast Phylath and make 10 plant tokens. You can then sacrifice Phylath and 2 tokens to make 6 mana, and let Phylath go back to the command zone. Then tap a forest and a mountain. Now you're up to 8 total mana, which is just enough to recast Phylath, and with his commander tax, you make 10 more tokens. And then you sacrifice Phylath again, and 3 of those tokens, and then tap another forest and another mountain, and recast Phylath again from the command zone. Congratulations, you've just created 30 tokens, and 25 of them are still alive, and it only took 10 lands. And even if you can't find a way to win with all these tokens right this second, your opponents will need to answer them soon, because if you draw into a win condition with 25 creature tokens on the board, you'll have a pretty good chance of winning that game. So those are the combos we're building around with Phylath. But for this deck tech, I want to go over some of the card draw and ramp that we're using, because a lot of these cards are specifically selected for synergy with our game plan. First, I want to talk about a few of the creatures we're playing. This is not a creature-heavy deck. We're heavily focused around abusing Phylaths under the battlefield trigger, and we don't want to dilute our strategy with unrelated creatures. But I do want to make space for Essence Warden. This is a 1/1 green elf that gives us 1 life whenever another creature enters the battlefield. Since we don't have a lot of blockers, especially flying blockers, we can end up taking a lot of combat damage, at least until Phylath makes a bunch of tokens for us. Essence Warden can help keep us in the game until we can find one of our win conditions, and it can generate a bunch of life if it's on the battlefield when we start casting and blinking Phylath. Now, as long as we're using token copy effects and blink effects, we'll also use Eternal Witness, and of course we'll play Avenger of Zendikar as an alternative to Phylath. But both of these are kind of obvious, so I don't feel like I need to say more about them. So let's talk about our mana ramp. So again, we're using several cards that allow us to blink or make token copies of our commander, so we might as well use creatures that have ETB effects that ramp us, since they can also benefit from being copied or blinked. So we'll definitely include Farhaven Elf, Wood Elves, Springbloom Druid. All of these have ETB effects that help us find basic lands. We're running a reasonably high amount of ramp in this deck, and absolutely all of it is land ramp. We don't want mana dorks or mana rocks, since Phylath cares about basic lands on the battlefield, and we are 100% trying to maximize Phylath's ETB effect. Now when it comes to card draw, of course we'll play Skull Clamp. This is kind of obvious in this deck, I don't really need to say anything more about it. But let's talk about Regal Force. This is a 5/5 elemental that costs 4 green, and when it enters the battlefield, you draw a card for each green creature you control. Now, Regal Force is currently seeing play in almost 8,000 decks on EDHREC. And I really don't like Regal Force most of the time because it costs a stupid amount of mana. 7 mana is a lot, and it requires that you have stuff on the board in order to give you card draw. But the plant tokens that Phylath makes are green, so you can easily draw, 10 plus cards with Regal Force, so I will play it here. Now, Endless Atlas I do like. This is an artifact that costs 2, and you can pay 2 and tap it to draw a card, but you can only activate this ability if you control 3 or more lands with the same name. Now, typically I wouldn't run Endless Atlas in anything other than a monocolor deck, since again you need those 3 lands with the same name to draw cards with it. And even in most 2-color decks, this can be hard to achieve. But since we're playing almost exclusively with basic lands, enabling Endless Atlas is trivial in this deck, so I'll use it even though we're in 2 colors. Now I also want to talk about Greater Good. This is an enchantment that lets you sacrifice a creature to draw cards equal to that creature's power, then discard 3 cards. So we can sacrifice Phylath to draw 5 cards, discard 3 cards, and put Phylath back in the command zone, so we can cast it again for more plant tokens. So this is nice. Of course, if we're getting Phylath's landfall trigger to put 4+1/+1 counters on one of our plants, then we can also sack that plant to Greater Good to draw 4 and discard 3. Also not bad. And I balance out these creature-based draw spells with cheaper, more universal card draw that I can use even with an empty board, like Thrill of Possibility and Harmonize and so on. Because when we choose card draw for our decks, it's important to include both early game card draw that will just help you hit your land drops and get set up and get going, as well as late game card draw that might require some synergies to work, but can draw you a bunch of cards. Now when it comes to removal, there's not too much I want to mention here, just because the removal pieces I've picked for this deck are fairly straightforward. Of course, just like always, you can see the link in the description to the full deck list. Blasphemous Act works really well in our deck because we'll generally single-handedly have enough creatures to reduce its mana cost to a single red, but Blasphemous Act is already really good in a lot of decks and it didn't need Phylath to make it worthwhile. I would run either Red Elemental Blast or Pyroblast along with Tybalt's Trickery, and they don't have any particular synergy with Phylath. But if my deck has red and it doesn't have blue in its color identity, then these cards are pretty much going into my deck almost all of the time, regardless of who's in the command zone, because countering spells is just that good, especially when you're not playing blue so your opponents don't expect it. Finally, I'll mention Subterranean Tremors, which is a weird X mana board wipe. It's a sorcery that costs X on a red, and it deals X damage to each creature without flying, and if X is 4 or more, you destroy all artifacts. And if X is 8 or more, you create an 8/8 lizard token. Sure. But I like Subterranean Tremors here because our deck isn't very reliant on artifacts. We have a few key ones like Ashnod's Altar, but for the most part this artifact destruction will hurt our opponents much more than us. Now for our lands, I've kept things very simple here. We absolutely want to push Phylath to the maximum, so I'm using 32 basic lands and 5 non-basics. And every single one of those non-basics just helps us ramp into more basics, like Blighted Woodland, or they help us fix our mana with basics, like Ash Barrens if we cycle it. There are no utility lands here because we're completely committed to pushing out as many plant tokens as we can with Phylath. Now I don't believe in running EDH decks without at least a little bit of graveyard hate, so rather than running graveyard hate on a land like Scavenger Grounds, I'm using Scavenging Ooze and Return to Nature. But those are the noteworthy cards in this deck that I wanted to mention for Phylath World Sculptor. Now let's go over the deck stats and cost. Our Phylath World Sculptor deck has an average converted mana cost of 3.00. We're running 37 lands, and again, all of those lands are either basic or they fetch basics. We also have 15 creatures, because Phylath's ETB trigger is our primary game plan, so we don't have a lot of other creatures. There are 7 cards that help make us more tokens, either directly or by generating extra enters the battlefield effects for our commander. We have 6 non-basic land hate cards, and we have 10 cards that make up our 3 possible win condition combos. We're also running 12 sources of mana ramp, and yep, every single one of those is a basic land ramp. We also have 9 sources of card draw. And finally, there are 13 sources of single target removal and 4 board wipes. The deck cost at the time of this recording is $173.22 on tcgplayer.com. There are 4 cards in this deck that cost more than $10. Magus of the Moon is a creature copy of Blood Moon, and it mostly shuts off non-basic lands. You could swap this out for some more budget-friendly non-basic land hate, depending on what type of land hate you're comfortable with running. Damping Sphere is a great option here that's fairly benign, as it'll primarily just stop excess mana from things like Gaia's Cradle or Nykthos or Nyxbloom Ancient and the like, while anyone playing fair magic will mostly escape unharmed. Speaking of fair magic, or perhaps the lack of it, there's also Ashnod's Altar in this deck, which your opponents will definitely not appreciate you using. Ashnod's Altar has been slowly climbing in price for a while, and it's just over $10 now. Honestly, sacrificing our tokens for mana is just about one of the strongest things you can do with the Phylath plant tokens, so I'd highly recommend keeping Ashnod's Altar in the deck if you possibly can. Now, I've kept Phyrexian Altar out of the deck just because it's $50. But obviously, it's a great fit for the deck if you have it, or if you just want to boost the deck's power level. Now, the easiest budget cut is probably Subterranean Tremors. Now, this is a regular X-mana red damage-based board wipe with decent upside, but it really isn't worth the $11 price tag in this deck. You could swap it out for something like Starstorm, which is much more affordable at under $1. And finally, I want to mention Cryptolith Rite. This card is around $10 right now, and it's not as good for us as something like Ashnod's Altar or Phyrexian Altar or even Thermopod. Now again, Cryptolith Rite seems better on the surface because we don't have to sacrifice our creatures with it to generate mana, we just have to tap them. But because of Summoning Sickness, I think Cryptolith Rite is actually much worse. Now most of the time, once you've assembled some combo and generated a bunch of tokens, then you can drop Cryptolith Rite as a finisher. So you won't need it to stick on the battlefield very long. So if you're on a budget, you could swap it for Song of Freyalise, which is less than $1. Song of Freyalise only mimics Cryptolith Rite by turning your creatures into mana dorks for 2 turns, but that's way more time than you'll need to execute, whatever combo. Alright, that is Phylath World Sculptor. This is a bit of a combo deck, but I like that Phylath can just create tons and tons and tons of plant tokens. Our deck is built to maximize those plant tokens by using as many basic lands as we can, and enters the battlefield effects to get Phylath's ETB effect over and over again. And again, we'll use that non-basic land hate to slow down our opponents, hopefully without being too stacksy for the most part. So if you're tired of regular Gruul landfall, this is a new and interesting way to play Phylath. But that's all I have for today. Please like this video or subscribe if you found any of this useful. I make commander-focused content showing you all sorts of unconventional ways that you can build your commander decks, from budget alternatives to deck decks to top 10 lists. And thank you for watching.